The basic theme of the spiritual teachings that I share could be referred to as the exploration of a more planetary or comprehensive or integral spirituality. This is not an uncommon theme these days. Concepts around the notion of a more integral, perennial, comprehensive, or planetary spirituality certainly date back more than a century. And in the 20th century, we have people like Sri Aurobindo, more recently Ken Wilber, as examples of many kinds of people who have worked with these kind of ideas and contributed to cultivating or exploring some sense of what that could mean. Even the concept of a more global spirituality can be approached from really, I think, a wide variety of angles. One is the notion of spiritual nature as being inherently very rich and multifaceted in itself. And so a more global spirituality can be thought of as addressing that richness and taking that richness into account, including the idea that there are different types of people and many different types of spiritual paths. And a more global spirituality would be inclusive of those differences, because we can notice, I think, that many spiritual traditions and different kinds of teachings and practices that are available often appeal to certain types more than others, even specific stages of the spiritual path more than others sometimes. And so one important meaning of a global spirituality is one that really addresses this broader richness of human nature and the different types of people, different kinds, therefore, of philosophical and perspectives, different styles of being on the path, different practices and sensibilities. So global spirituality would be have a broader richness of embrace of human nature and of different kinds of people on the path. That would be one example. Another aspect of global or richer or more integral spirituality would be that it addresses all the different ways that spirituality can be integrated into our lives. A global spirituality or a comprehensive spirituality should be something that embraces both the meditative and introspective life as well as the day-to-day life and activities, and the broad spectrum of richness that entails. Concepts of a more modern, emergent, and kind of global spirituality certainly, therefore, would include also, I think we see this trend, it's just sort of organic, sort of a grassroots inclination to move towards a spirituality that's more non-sectarian, that values the existing spiritual traditions and different approaches, draws on them, draws inspiration, and isn't necessarily rigid or narrow in identification. Many people commonly feel a sense of wanting to participate either sequentially or at the same time in different approaches, different traditions, having different teachers. And although that's a complicated issue, I think the more emerging global spirit seems to be more in the direction of this broader recognition of the value of different traditions. So less sectarian, less hierarchical, moving towards more gender balance, embracing trends of modern culture like science and psychology, So the emergent spirituality has a lot of different facets to it. But one of the most important, I think, is really addressing a kind of richer, more profound understanding of human nature, and the fullness of human potential spiritual in terms of our spirituality, and the different kinds of people, of human nature as a broader concept, so that there's an understanding of the richness of different kinds of human beings. This is definitely one of the more important aspects to me of the emergent, more integral and global spirituality. Many other features of it could be named as well. One of these is certainly the notion of 7 archetypal types or rays or paths. These correlate, in my view, with the chakras, so that we could even say that there are chakra types. There are people that are more connected to the throat center and the inner type of wisdom, the principles and the qualities and energies and capacities associated with that center are vast and rich and deep. And one could follow that style, as you might say, the throat chakra path, to the most profound levels of enlightenment. In this view, then, the chakras are not viewed as a kind of ascending model where higher chakras are more enlightened than so-called lower chakras, but rather that every chakra is a profound center of potential enlightenment. Every center has a layer of obstruction, of limitation or samsara, ignorance over its functioning. And so in the average human being, there's no real fully enlightened chakra that's just waiting to be tapped into. All the chakras are capable of being centers of confusion and ignorance and attachment, or being awakened and liberated and transformed into a center of enlightenment. So from this view, all the chakras need to be cultivated, to be maintained in balance. Each has its own special contribution to a human spirituality to make. And the energy shouldn't be thought of as something that should be withdrawn from one chakra and moved into another, as if that chakra is problematic and the other chakra is the spiritual center. In the context of this understanding, then, each chakra is equally profound and significant in a total integral human understanding of spirituality. And each of these chakras, if that's one way to look at this, these differences in human nature, is inherently in its own right a style of being, a perspective, a center of spiritual consciousness, and therefore a path in and of itself. You could say that there's a root chakra path, the liberation that's more grounded and integrated with day-to-day life and about the earth element and so on and so forth. Each chakra has its own sensibility and focus. And ultimately, as we evolve through any of these doorways, we would incorporate all of them into a more complete form of human awakening and spiritual development. So that is a good example, I think, of one of the key ideas that, to my mind, is very important in a more integral global spirituality. In this context, another point of view, and offering this video in part as just a standalone video, just tapping into these themes a bit, but also as a kind of an introduction to the upcoming webinar that will go in greater depth into these themes. The theme of this webinar is the concept of an integral spirituality, a planetary spirituality, but in the light of like yet another way to understand human spirituality and some of the basic components of the spiritual path. And this is more of the concept of the spiritual path having three main dimensions to it, if you will, facets or aspects, so that a complete human spirituality would again make use of all of these features and would grow naturally through both cultivation and ultimately a spontaneous unfoldment would express each of these dimensions. They're all key to a complete human development in the spiritual path. One of these I would call simply the element of spiritual practice and awakening that has to do with our own fundamental liberation process, our own process of enlightenment, coming to a place of self-realization, of attaining a sense of inner wholeness, inner peace, and inner fulfillment, of completing a process of finding our true nature and resting in that true nature and integrating that experience into day-to-day life, which leads to a deeper sense of wholeness and fulfillment. So a classic understanding of the spiritual path in terms of enlightenment. The second aspect is not uncommonly incorporated in some degree or another in many spiritual paths, which is the notion of also participating in the awakening of other beings, the evolution, the well-being of other beings. So being of service in Buddhism, this would be the path of bodhisattvahood, the path of loving kindness and generosity and compassion. And on a global spirituality, I think that this is an inevitable and important component. And the third of these three components is the way participating in the reality that all spiritual paths unfold in the human kingdom, at least, in the context of individuals who have some degree of development on the path, and then they end up sharing that understanding, a sense of transmission or empowerment, of support and help, teaching to others. This empowerment can come in a wide variety of ways, but of course, teaching work is a key element of that, but in lots of other ways as well. And so there's a way in which our spiritual, to really participate in a rich form of the spiritual path that's most balanced and sort of honors all the aspects of human nature and all the aspects of what would make the path as sort of more complete and efficient. We want to make use of the notion, this experience of participating in some version of a transmission, ultimately in both ways, receiving and giving. And that aspect also is something, just like the other two, that can be approached in a variety of ways, and also at different stages of development. It's really something that can be brought to very subtle and profound and rich levels of development. It's not a static thing, and it's not only for particular stages of the path. It's part of the complete spectrum of participation in individual and collective awakening. So one of the things that we'll go into in this webinar is deepening our sense of the significance of each of these three components: individual awakening, service, and participation in transmission, the line of transmission, of lineage, of initiation and empowerment in the various forms that can take. And that's a very rich topic in and of itself, all those different dimensions and ways that we can participate in if you will, a lineage style of transmission. That doesn't necessarily mean participating, for instance, in an outer lineage whereby there's a particular tradition in the physical world and we engage that lineage in a more formal way, making a commitment to a particular teacher, some people feel drawn to do that. That's fine. That's very powerful. Some people might choose to participate more generally in different kinds of things, may emphasize more reading over individual instruction, may be more interested in groups rather than one-on-one transmission or with a particular teacher, may be interested in more modern lineages or teaching activities rather than ancient forms, may receive their empowerment and transmission more internally with internal teachers of various sorts. There's a wide variety of ways that people can experience this. So I'm not advocating a specific way per se. When we talk about this, it's just noting that this is actually an integral part of any spiritual path. It's not really optional in the sense that it's almost like built into human nature. We come into a world where we have parents and elders in the community. There's just different ways, teachers and so on. Transmission is just part of human nature, part of human culture, and certainly it's part of every spiritual lineage. And there really isn't much of a reality to the fact that one can do it on their own. We're always embedded both physically and subtly in a system of support and empowerment in our spiritual evolution. So what this is really about is more like cultivating a greater awareness of that, the significance of that, and how to make choices about what ways we want to engage that and cultivate it and invoke it. And there's many different versions of that and stages. And there's even if we want to do work with, say, the planetary lineage, which is ultimately at this point not a lineage that's accessible too much in the physical world. These beings embodying the deeper planetary spirituality of the earth do exist, and in general sort of are at the highest stages, among other things, not only in terms of personal enlightenment, but also in terms of the depth of their service, their compassion, their bodhisattvahood, if you will, but also in terms of the richness of their understanding of the power of lineage and transmission. It's possible to invoke a relationship to such beings. That's not only very enriching to our own spiritual growth, but it empowers our service and it empowers the work of the lineage. So for those who are attracted to that, again, in my work, that's not a requirement per se that one in the spiritual educational work that I do, but it's certainly something that I participate in and I share about the nature of that work and how to go about it, how to deepen that for those who are interested. And that is, again, part of this webinar too, is going to be going a little deeper into that, into the nature of the planetary lineage. And this includes some of the deepest levels, ultimately, the potential to make contact with, or at least attune or invoke the deeper, more enlightened presences that are in relationship to our earth in various ways. How to cultivate a relationship, an attunement, and an invocation of these intelligences, these enlightened beings, and to invoke their influence and cultivate our own ability to align ourselves with the service work that these beings are engaged in. This doesn't necessarily require developing psychic abilities or anything like that. There's more powerful yet accessible and fundamental or foundational ways to go about that are accessible to anybody, and yet certainly work as a setting of foundation. So going deeper into that, including what is traditionally considered sort of deep practices of spiritual relationship with deity, is traditionally called deity, God, goddess, however one conceives of that. These really represent some of the most profound beings in the spectrum of the lineage. In a sense, you could say at the heart of any lineage is the primordial enlightened presence or universal forms of enlightened presence. And so we'll go deeper into what are ways to understand the nature of even what that is, and how to work directly with that and experience not only communion, empowerment, transformation, healing, enlightenment, but also an empowerment that flows into our lives and perhaps gives some strength and inspiration and empowerment to our activity and calling and service in the world as well. So that's a kind of a quick overview of some of these themes for those that might want to have a better understanding of the nature of this webinar, as well as just even for those who aren't interested in the webinar, for just a kind of quick overview of something that I feel is actually another foundational piece of understanding the type of spirituality that's growing in the world. Some of it's sort of in early stages, that although lineage empowerment, that's what I'm calling this third piece, individual service, individual enlightenment, service, and participation in some type of lineage or communion with a spiritual community or presence or transmission, that all three of these make up a rich and more balanced form of understanding the spiritual path and its full potential. Sometimes people will start with any of these three and not necessarily all at the same time or in equal measure. Some people, for instance, will make contact with a physical teacher and participate in that teacher's work, and that will develop in them a spirit of service. And ultimately, they'll realize that the more enlightened and mature they are spiritually, the more powerful their service. And so they come at it from that angle and come around to being interested in deepening their own enlightenment. Some people start at the other end of that spectrum or in the middle. So it can be begun in different ways, evolve in different ways. Ultimately, this is the notion that having a balanced appreciation, even if one isn't working on all aspects at the same time, that each of these aspects ultimately will become part of our path in the fullest stages of spiritual development. And so it's useful to at least have a kind of foundational understanding. And then as part of that, we'll particularly be looking at, as also, not exclusively, but a big piece of that, we'll be looking at a specific way to understand lineage empowerment, which particularly will go into a deeper understanding of the nature of the planetary lineage and the nature of the central intelligences like planetary and solar logi, who are the sort of core lineage holders in the sort of local version, you might say, of the Dharma in the cosmic sense, the sort of main progenitor archetypal beings and intelligences, planetary Christs and solar Christs and Buddhas that founded the human kingdom, continue to work with humanity until this day, and with whom one can develop a personal relationship, as well as the innumerable other types of beings, enlightened beings and archangelic intelligences that are also part of the spiritual community of our earth. Also, ultimately work in that same larger context of lineage. So there's many ways to do that work, but we'll be looking into it in greater detail, the various ways, the nature of all of that, and the ways to participate in it, even if at a very basic foundational level. So thanks for listening, and that concludes this piece.